Thank you, Maddie. Ella, I remember talking to you 2 years ago and saying, I can't wait to see you under the book tent in the Athenaeum. And you said, oh no. You intended to have an audience, so here we are today.
Well, it's good to be here, and it's, I really am still pinching myself.
Yeah, well,
but I am here.
And it's a delight to be able to have this conversation with you. We've talked about these issues quite a bit over the last 2-3 years. And now that they're all in the book, you get to share them with everybody else. So I want to start this conversation with asking you, where were you when you first knew you were going to be able to reclaim joy?
Oh, on Main Street, Nantucket.
Really?
In 2013. My husband died in 2009, and though I look back and see that there were most certainly moments of joy in my life, all I remembered really was the dark side, the grief, the pain, the difficulty. And that summer, I was just really wanting to run away from home as much as anything else. I signed up for that little American Cruise Line small ship cruise of Maine, flew in and out of Boston. And I decided to stay away from Texas heat for another week and come to Nantucket. And then I got really worried about it. I had just been here for a day trip by ferry with my husband. And we knew we liked it, but the idea of being in such a remote place by myself for a week frightened me. So 4 days I could stand. Unpack one day, explore the town the next day, explore the island the next day, and then pack and go home. So anyone can bear that. But I mean, I could almost take you to the spot, Janet. Walking down Main Street, I realized that I hadn't felt that good since my husband died. And I had this, what I now know as an insane notion, I should write a book to help other widows find joy.
And so what did you do with that information when you discovered that you had that idea and might be able to do it? We got a north wind coming in here.
Well, I mean, because I have a journalism background, as you know, so I'm not completely foreign to writing. The books and memoirs and things like that were foreign to me. But I knew it would take a lot of time. I also knew it would take solitude and introspection, which were things I had been avoiding for more than 4 years. So I took the year to think about it, and I guess by spring of the next year, probably 9 or 10 months later, I made reservations for 18 days at the White Elephant and spent a month just reading very slowly and with lots of meditation time, the Apostle Paul's letter to the Philippians, which uses joy and rejoice 14 times in 3 pages, as you know. And so I came here that summer and hung the Do Not Disturb sign on the door every morning and wrote 30,000 words in 18 days. And I have slogged through ever since.
So Philippians, because of the notion of joy. And did you put some kind of structure to it? I mean, did you have a chapter outlined when you came here?
Yeah, that fell into place pretty easily. I guess that's what I did in that month of meditation there are 4 chapters. And so that was, because though a lot of people just read it quickly as a novel, I found that, and that's why I called it a primer, because, it's meant to be a first reader. Those first days were so insane and crazy. I mean, you really do think you're losing your mind at first. And I found that for myself, taking a few minutes during the day to just pause and recenter helped me get through everything. And so I tried to write it where people could do it however they wanted, but that for the person who would like, the chapters are short, your attention span is short when you're new in grief. So where someone could use it just for a break during the day. So I carved each of the 4 chapters into 4 chapters of Philippians into 7 sections. But I didn't know what form it would take in terms of literature. I had no idea. It wasn't planned to be a memoir at all. That was sort of surprised that that's what came out.
And hard as a journalist to write about yourself.
Oh, terribly hard. And, the other thing I found as a journalist, well, there were lots of things that made it different. Journalists write in an inverted pyramid where you get who, what, when, where, why, and how in paragraph 1, and you get more and more boring as you go on so that people don't miss anything important if they don't get to the end of the story. So the idea of having to keep people turning the pages was a challenge. I wasn't used to writing in the long form. But journalists, even in editorial or opinion writing, which I've done some of, are very careful with the qualifiers in saying allegedly and apparently and arguably, using those kind of words. And I realized that in a book, you need to speak with authority whether you really have any or not. So the qualifiers had to come out.
So one of the things that, as a widow, that I've experienced is certainly solitude, but it also comes with independence. But I have a lot of friends, some in this room, who often ask me, are you going to date again? What's your take on that spin?
Oh my goodness, the last thing in the world I wanted to. Haven't been on a date since 1962. That sounds perfectly dreadful.
But don't you appreciate the independence and the solitude? You decide when you're going to go to bed, what you have for breakfast.
I think that I'm going to address the two separately.
Okay.
As you know, at first the loneliness is just overwhelming. The fact that you're the only one there. And so moving from lonely to alone and coming to grips with being alone, I think is one of the huge challenges that anyone in grief faces. And in a way, writing the book forced me to spend more time alone and to learn the value of solitude. I find now that if I'm with people all day, every day, and have a very busy schedule, that I start needing time alone to reflect. But that came gradually. And see, I've already forgotten the other half of the question. The solitude.
The independence.
The independence. And most experienced widows and widowers have told me, and I say experienced because, again, you need some time to get there. There's a certain selfishness about it. And I'd say that for many of us, it is the first time in our lives where we have had the discretionary time and money to do exactly what we want to do, when we want to do, and we don't have to ask anybody's permission or please anyone else. I mean, the simple act of cooking, because my husband I'm a good cook, but he was a picky eater. And now I can do all of these really crazy things in the kitchen, and there's no one to complain if they're flop.
I was happy to put salt back on the table.
Oh, yeah. So I mean, we have to look for those. I mean, I call it God's compensation, that it doesn't, that independence certainly doesn't compare to what it was like to share your life with someone. Independence is one of the compensations.
And another key theme that runs through your book is family first, and doing whatever you can to keep the family together. And there are ways to do estate planning or whatever that enhances that. And you ran into some of that in your experience.
Well, I ran into a lot of it because what I've discovered, and I've gotten feedback as I've spoken as well, is that estate planners are only interested in tax savings. They do not take into consideration how it affects the family dynamic, how difficult administration is going to be. I would say that many older widows are not physically up to meeting the demands of complicated estates, and none of that is ever talked about. I mean, I've had female CPAs who told me it had never occurred to them to have that conversation with their clients, which is just appalling. And the other shock is that families fall apart after loss. And I couldn't figure out why. You'd think it would draw everybody together, but the fact is, the children, the grandchildren, the brothers, the sisters, everybody's grieving, and as a result, nobody's thinking too analytically, and everybody is overreacting and misspeaking, and everybody gets their feelings hurt. And if you're not careful, it just completely gets out of control. So to give everyone grace, to forgive and overlook the words spoken in grief.
Mm-hmm. It does take a lot of forgiveness.
Well, and we have to forgive ourselves because of the guilt we carry that, I should have done something differently. The what if said, if onlys.
Mm-hmm. Yes, yeah. Your book can be helpful to people addressing a lot of different kinds of losses. Divorce, loss of a job, losing a home. Ambiguous losses is the phrase I've heard you use to talk about those. Do you agree with that notion?
Yes, and it's been a surprise to me. So, it's not in the book because it's been the feedback since the book came out. I just have been surprised. I guess the first surprise was the divorced women 10, 15 years younger than I, who kept telling me, you describe my grief. It was a loss of plans, a loss of dreams, a loss of hopes. And it just like, even more so probably than when the separation is by death rather than divorce or estrangement, it's the loss of friends, it has the financial impact, there's a financial impact. All of those things are impacted in all sorts of losses. And I was actually just introduced to this term, ambiguous losses, by a grief expert at the Baylor School of Social Work a few months ago, because I was hearing more and more of this and I wanted to understand what was happening. And that's the term that's used clinically, is ambiguous losses. So there are so many. I've decided that loss and the grief that we feel in loss is the loss of the tomorrows of our dreams. And whatever it is that causes the loss of what we dreamed life would be like, whether it's financial setbacks or relocation where you leave behind all your memories and your friends, or health issues that may change your tomorrows. We grieve all of those things, and that grief is valid.
Absolutely. So did you read, which other authors did you read on the topic to help shape your thinking or bounce your own thoughts off of?
Well, I didn't read at all until the third draft, because I didn't know quite what the writing teachers were talking about when they said, find your voice. But I wasn't sure what my voice was. And I also know that I have an ability to mimic in writing. I'm not a verbal mimic, but I discovered myself taking on the writing style of whoever I'm reading. So I didn't want to be guilty of plagiarism accidentally by remembering something someone else said and putting it in. So I wanted the book to be pretty far along. And so actually I wrote the emotional and the memoir parts first. And then I went back and did the research to make sure that what I was saying agreed with the literature on the subject. And so I couldn't remember all the books now. There are like 64, I think, in the bibliography in the back, but reread all of the C.S. Lewis books, read the literary memoirs like Joan Didion and Joyce Carol Oates, read some pretty bad memoirs. One that sticks into mine is The Widows Wear Stilettos. That one was
And Sheryl Sandberg's book came out.
Well, it came out too late to be in the book, but she had given that speech at Berkeley a year after her husband died. And So I read the book. I'd recommended option B to anyone. And if anyone isn't familiar with Sheryl Sandberg, she's the COO of Facebook. And quite a young woman. And her husband dropped dead on a treadmill when they were vacationing in Mexico, and she had to come back home and break the news to 2 children. And she had a company to run. And what she said, and I did this intuitively, and others that I know that have come through grief to reclaim joy virtually always say that gratitude is what got them through. Learning to focus on what you had and being grateful for what you had rather than focusing on what you lost. But Sheryl Sandberg's rabbi told her to keep a journal, and at the end of every day to write down 3 moments of joy in her life that day. And it could be a child's hug, praise from a colleague, it could be little things. But then to go to bed thinking about those moments of joy. And so you can see where that would help you instead of going to bed and not sleeping because you're ruminating about everything that went wrong that day, or you're worrying about all you face tomorrow. And the other way I think it's good to write it down is that, 3 moments of joy a day add up to over 1,000 a year. And in your lowest moment where you can't find anything to be joyful about or to be thankful for, you have that journal to pick up and remind you that there really were moments of joy.
And you've recently done in your blog, I believe, sort of a workbook using your book to help people. You did this during Lent, didn't you?
I did it during Lent, and actually, Janet, you haven't seen it yet. Deborah has, so I've redeveloped it as a workbook.
Oh, good.
So I'm getting there.
Yeah, so there'll be a handy little tool in addition to your book for people to use. That's great. Well, I would be remiss as the Director of Culture and Tourism if I didn't talk to you about Nantucket.
Oh, good. I like talking about Nantucket.
Because it's clear that this book is an ode to Nantucket. It's got a picture of Cisco Beach on the front. You wrote it here. You decided, you learned you could reclaim joy here. Tell me a little bit about what you love about our beautiful island.
Well, the thing I noticed the minute I got here, driving in from the airport, I came in on a Sunday afternoon. It happened to be the day after Pops on the Beach. I didn't know that this was the busiest time and it was packed. But I remember on Main Street, I was staying at the Jared Coffin House that first year. And all of these groups of children, little girls window shopping and little boys with their skateboards sitting on the benches. And I'd seen the 43 private jets lined up out at the airport coming in. So I knew that seeing the children on Main Street tell me 2 things about Nantucket immediately. One, that this was a safe place because the parents that owned those jets would not be turning their children loose on the streets of Nantucket if they didn't feel like their children were safe. And the second thing it told me was that this was a summer community and not places where people come for a week with their family and leave, because here were groups of children who all knew each other. And then very quickly after that, I started, as I started window shopping, I noticed all of the little ribbons. I don't remember what color the Autism Speak ribbons are. They're the blue ribbons. And because it was that week, and all of the shops were offering discounts that week for Autism Speaks. And so I realized what a philanthropic community this is. I got stuck at the Whaling Museum during a rainstorm. And so I learned all about the history of Nantucket and watched that marvelous film, and I could appreciate the influence of Quakerism here. And all of that, besides just the fact that I was a history major and I love old buildings and old things, and I love flowers, and the water is always soothing. And then a couple of years later, of course, out of curiosity, I wandered into this church.
Oh, yes. Yes. This has been a home for you, hasn't it?
It has been. It is.
And there's an interesting backstory to that, too, from where your relations came from. Because you're essentially, when you get to the core of it, a Yankee. Because your family came from Connecticut, right?
Well, yes, that was their first, end of Winthrop's fleet. First settled minister in Wethersfield, Connecticut in 1638. And obviously Puritan. And I had never been to a Puritan or Congregational service. Now you have to realize my family moved. 5 generations later, there was a Congregational minister. He was a Tory. He got kicked out of Massachusetts. They took a ship to New Orleans and sailed up to Natchez, Mississippi, which was British. And so that's the history our family knew, was the Southern history. Didn't really know the New England history until genealogy went on board. So I was curious. I was sort of surprised to find out I was from New England Puritans. And so I decided one day when I was here alone just to wander. I was still staying at the hotel, wandered up the hill to come to the service here.
And some bells were ringing, I think.
Yeah, bells were ringing.
Yes, our carillon. But so you've been here 5 summers now? This is your 5th summer? 6th summer?
Well, I was 3 summers before I started renting the house, and this is my 4th year in the house.
Okay.
So 7 summers since my very first visit.
And so in all that time that you've been here, you've been working on the book.
Yes.
What are you going to do this summer?
Have fun.
Have you been to the beach yet?
No, I haven't been to the beach yet.
in those 7 years?
Oh, to look at it. Not to stay.
Not to go in it.
Yeah, you promised you will take me in your 4-wheel drive to a beach.
And I promised to take you through the moors, too,
Yes.
Alta Rock and all of that. Yeah, because I don't have pinstripes on my new car yet, so it would be a good time to do that.
Okay.
Well, we asked the question about the church, but you mentioned that this place was built even after your family migrated.
Yeah, but it's still amazing to me to be in here. I think, Gary, the date's a little wrong, isn't it? Fudged just slightly.
1725, circa.
But there was a congregation existing prior.
11, probably.
So yeah, it's quite amazing to me to realize that this congregation has been worshiping on this island
In this building.
almost as long as my family's been in America.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a pretty compelling history.
It is a very compelling history, especially in a place that was so rich with Quaker history as well.
Yeah.
That this church would have, because the summer church was built during the whaling era, and think of that place being filled, enormous amount of folks worshiping here. You and I have had conversations about recent academic work, and you referenced some activity that you've been following at Baylor about the impact, the neurological impact of grief.
Uh-oh.
Well, and I think you referenced it too when you were talking about how families fall apart because they don't ask or they say inappropriate things to each other. But you mentioned to me that there's some kind of connection that doesn't happen between parts of the brain during grief. Can you talk a little more about that?
Yeah, and I mean, I got curious. I mean, things are happening, and we all hear these things. Don't make any decisions the first year. The things we're supposed to do, there's never an explanation of why. And I wanted to know why these things were happening and why we weren't supposed to make decisions and why families were falling apart. And it was triggered originally because I have a little granddaughter-in-law who is a neuroscientist. And so several years ago, she made this fascinating statement to me that the frontal cortex, where reason and analytical thinking take place, and the amygdala, the fight, flight, freeze response, are like a seesaw. And when our emotions and our stress and our fear and our anxiety kick in, the frontal cortex shuts down. And I thought, oh, that explains so much. That just explains so much. It's not that a year is a magical number, but this is why those first months are so rocky, because we can't think straight. I mean, literally, we can't think straight. So I kept seeing more and more, putting more pieces together, afraid I was adding 2 and 2 and getting 16. So I requested an appointment with one of the neuroscientists at Baylor University. And a young neuroscientist, she just finished her work about 25 years ago, right when this was, her studies, right as this was beginning to come about. And so with MRIs and PET scans, they are able to tell exactly what part of the brain is activated by specific experiences or words or such. And there's a neural connection between that's very thin, between the frontal cortex and the amygdala. And now, I don't understand this, Janet. You're a scientist, you may be able to explain it better than I do. But literally, I've been using the phrase, we get stuck in grief. And the message of my book is that you don't have to stay stuck. But I didn't realize that that's literally what happens, is that the grief somehow gets stuck in that narrow neural channel. And so the frontal cortex doesn't function properly, and we get into this loop of negative thinking. And it takes therapy. You can rewire the brain, but it's hard.
And that daily activity of recording incidents of joy is a typical therapeutic response.
That is one of the typical therapies, is the being thankful, and practicing gratitude. And another therapy that was also intuitive, I talk about the serenity prayer. Mm-hmm. I think that's the issue with especially with ambiguous losses. There's nothing ambiguous about death.
Right.
We can't deny that happened. So the challenge of the serenity prayer, if you've had anything to do with AA or Al-Anon, you know it, Lord, give me the
God grant me the serenity.
The strength to change what can be changed, the serenity to accept what can't be changed, and the wisdom to know the difference. Mm-hmm. And the wisdom to know the difference is the challenge. But it turns out that's one of the therapies for getting over grief as well, is doing problem solving. So, okay, what can I change? What can I not change? And so if I can change this, then how do I go? And sometimes all we can change is ourselves.
Yeah, ultimately that might be the only thing that we can change.
Right. And so, I guess we intuitively figure this out when we're desperately climbing out of the grief pit. Yeah. But it turns out there are biological, neurological explanations of what's going on.
Yeah, in addition to all the aches and pains that you feel when you're first carrying that emotional load of grief.
Yeah, and it turns out there is also connected in the brain. I don't remember what the name of this little piece is, but it's where the map of the body is. And so that's how then all of this stuff gets transmitted into the aches and pains and headaches and so on and so forth.
I want to go back to the Philippians and the 4 chapters divided into 7 and the 28 chapters that you came up with and the 28 verses that are in your prayer at the end of the book. Is there a significance to the number 28?
28 days, 4 weeks. That's all. No magic numbers.
So it's like a chapter a day.
It's just a few verses a day, a chapter of my book a day, which most of them are about 6 pages, maybe 7 pages long.
Yeah. Are there any other books coming along in your future?
Well, I think about them, but then the idea of spending more time at my computer writing here instead of having fun, it would be a Nantucket book of some sort if there were a book. But
I heard something about a cookbook.
Well, the family lobbies for a cookbook because I really one of the things I did in grief was I put on 20 pounds. I guess it actually started when my husband was sick and I just didn't have time to take care of myself. And so it was several years later that I went to a doctor, a medically supervised weight loss program, and started eating healthier. And so, again, cooking alone, So I cook spinach for breakfast with an egg on top. But I've had fun doing this cooking alone. I love cooking alone up here. I mean, I call Nantucket my detox time. I try to eat only things that come out of local waters or are grown in local soil. So the trips to the fish market and the Bartlett's Farm truck on Main Street are big parts of what I enjoy doing here. And so the family's been lobbying for me to do a cookbook for one, because the young people getting out in college and getting out of college don't know how to cook for one either or shop for one.
I vote for that book too.
So, but
They know me by first name at all the pizza shops.
well, yeah.
So a Nantucket book you think might be in the offing,
Eventually, maybe.
but after you have fun this summer.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, if I haven't really had time to cook yet. I have 2 weeks just with nothing on the calendar coming up. I'm very excited about these 2 weeks. And of course, the produce is just coming in. There's just now beginning things to show up at Bartlett's Farm Store. So I'll get back in the cooking next week. And I do write down the recipes. I have a folder of Nantucket recipes that I cart back and forth and the things that I develop here. I'm going to make a tomato pie next week.
Oh, good. I'll be over.
So,
Did you know that writing a book was just the first part of being an author?
explain that.
Well, I know you've had a good 9 months of talking about the book, giving speeches. You got a couple more coming up to a group of Baptist ministers.
I got to tell them what to do.
You get to tell them what to do.
Also, I have a brand new one that I've been approached about, is I get to tell the men who are customers of the bank what they should do and not do to not leave their wives in a mess. And that one's exciting too.
Yeah, yeah. How did you find that kind of work?
Well, the radio talk shows were really part of the promotion that came from the press, and that's, of course, the huge difference between being self-published or being published by. I wasn't published really by a trade press. I was published, oddly enough, by a university, an academic press, but it gives you a credibility and things that you can't. It's hard to get a book review, let alone be on a talk show or anything like that. I mean, my first talk show, I think, was NPR here.
Is that right?
Last summer. And so all of those things were arranged for me. But then people, everybody needs programs. Every organization needs programs. And one leads to another in terms of the invitations. And so it's been interesting. And I've been grateful for it. But I had no idea how much time it would take. I just had no idea what was. It really started when I first got here last year. The book didn't come out till the end of September, but I just started being hit with publication things in June.
Yeah.
So, yeah, this is started after today. I don't have anything on my calendar. This is the most until next October. So, that's really a nice feeling.
Yeah, yeah. You are going to get to play. Congratulations.
Yeah, I am.
You're going to be retired.
I have never retired, but anyway. But I will get to enjoy the great-grandchild that's coming.
Great. Congratulations.
Yes.
And how much time do you still spend with Prichard Oil?
It varies. Unfortunately, yesterday was one of those days, unexpectedly. Yeah, but every week, and it's just unpredictable. That's the hard part. Didn't know that about Maddie, but when you have, even though I have outsourced the day-to-day management, when there are hurdles, when there are problems or various issues, then I have to drop everything else.
Yeah.
And
is there anything that I've missed that you wanted to share about your book with this audience today?
I can't think of anything. You've covered it pretty well, Janet.
Well, thank you. I think we should ask if anybody has a question.
Yes.
My sister is stuck in grief. She lost her husband a year ago, and she's not been happy for 1 minute what would you suggest? You said you had write down 3 things, or there are several ways. How do you get out of that? Just the first step to get out of the grief if you're just totally unhappy.
Well, for me, I just absolutely couldn't stand the feeling. Now, there are people who the grief and becomes a friend, and they sort of want to stay at the pity party. So wanting to move beyond it is, I think, the first issue. One of the things and it's something we didn't talk about, and I think it is important, we linger in our memories. And I call it the lavender half-life of mourning, when we just linger in the memories. C.S. Lewis has the book Surprised by Joy, but he writes about it in a number of his autobiographical works. First of all, he says, joy is easier to find than happiness because it's these brief ecstatic moments. It's not the sustained happiness. There's a famous quote when he talks about losing his mother when he was a little boy, that though there were moments of joy, all settled happiness vanished from their family home. And that really set me thinking, okay, that doesn't sound logical. It sounds like you'd move from happiness to joy. But actually, you move to joy, and then you have more moments of joy, and eventually you realize that the happiness is outweighing the sadness. But the other thing he said, and this is backed up by the social scientists and such, is that joy consists of 2 things, memory and anticipation. Because joy, he doesn't say it's something like cocaine, but it's what I read about the euphoria of cocaine is that once you've had it, you want it again. And the joy here on Nantucket, it's a thrill to be here. It's a thrill the first time I see the church steeple or hear the church bells or see the roses or the hydrangeas or, on and go down to the harbor. A long list of things that just cause my spirit to soar when I experience the first time. But then, during the 10 months I'm not here, it's both the memories of last summer, but the anticipation that I'll be back. And I can remember with my mother, who was in very poor health when my dad died. And so she was frail. She never pulled out of the grief completely. But if she knew someone was coming to visit, if there was something that gave her something to anticipate, it lifted her spirits. And so it makes sense that anticipation is a very strong positive emotion. And I learned, I would look at my calendar and it would be blank, and weekends are terrible because your couple friends are doing things, and weekends really drag. And for the couples that go to church on Sunday and then for brunch, and you go home and have this empty day. And so I learned to start reaching out and making sure that I didn't have single friends, or very, very few. And I had not been a good friend to my friends who had been widowed or divorced early. I sat down, probably 6 or 8 months later, made a list came up with 9 women that I knew well enough to invite to my house. But, I asked them over for soup on a Sunday night or something. But I learned to try to get something on my calendar for every week, something for the weekend, because if I had just a few things, and I accepted every nonprofit event, everything that came along that to get myself among people. And so that helped. There's a chapter I have on hospitality. And someplace, not in Philippians, but somewhere else, Paul writes, practice hospitality. So I'm convinced that throwing a party is biblical. and that we're all supposed to throw parties and have people over. And I mean, I'm very, very shy, and it was very hard for me to call people that I didn't see regularly and just saying, okay, the worst that can happen is that they will say no. And, you know, I can survive people saying no. So, you know, and so I think you can help in a way by giving her things to look forward to and encouraging her to see people. Isolation's a killer. I mean, isolation really is a killer. You don't need to be alone. The other thing, especially those who are still married and want to help a single friend, I mean, and I have some really good friends, and they're wonderful about calling me for lunch. Well, my life is busy, and my life was terribly busy. The first year after my husband's death, with all that you have to do, I call it the detritus of death, all this stuff you have to do that's not fun or pleasant or happy at all. And 5 o'clock would come, and it was, oh my God, what am I going to do for the next 5 hours? I mean, and I think every one person who is suddenly alone, I call them us the suddenly singles, and the evening comes. And so I have a couple of good friends who are good about including me for dinner, and even a couple who will invite me to go along on trips. So not being forced into an all-female go out to lunch and eat leftovers at home alone every night is important for most women. I mean, some are content with that, but I wasn't.
Is there another question? Let's go back to some of your Nantucket. Oh, we got one over here.
Does your book apply to men as well as women?
You know, I wrote it for women because it's a woman's story, and men tend not to be as introspective as women. And so I didn't try to make it inclusive. I'm sort of smiling because the couple that served as my mentors and editors on this project are sitting over there grinning because they wanted me to make it neutral for the widowed. But, you know, I can't tell you, that's one of the things, it's not a how-to book. I found, and I still can't even in blogs and such use the word you very often. Each of us is unique, our situation is unique, our grief is unique, how we respond to it's unique. All I can do is tell my story. And if there's something, and the stories of others, I've interviewed other widows, I've quoted from literature. If you can learn something from the way somebody else has done it, I write about my failures and my mistakes as well. Mm-hmm. You know, the things that it's not a good idea to do it the way I did it. So some men have benefited from it but they're the men who are capable of making those transitions and saying, okay, like one man said, yes, you say it's the 5 o'clock when he doesn't come home from work. For us, it's that we don't go home from work because we'd be going home to the empty house. And so it you know, it depends on the man, whether they can have that kind of reflective personality to make the transition.
Yes.
Can you explain how you've traveled the world since you've become, I know you travel a great deal with husband, you travel a lot by yourself, and I think that's wonderful, and I think that you could give other women the courage to do that. Could you just
Oh yeah, I mean, I literally, in one trip a few years ago, well, this was really pretty early on. I did circumnavigate the world. I mean, I flew San Francisco to Hong Kong to Hanoi, to Cambodia and Laos and Thailand and Sri Lanka, and then on to Paris and back home. But I love to travel, and I found, I mean, I don't do things like that totally alone. And I did it in starting out in baby steps. It was like the trip here that I flew to Boston and spent a couple of days in Boston alone, and then joined the Smithsonian Institution for the cruise of the main shore, and then I came here for 4 days afterwards. If I was a guest of friends in Carmel, California for a week, I flew down to Los Angeles for a couple of days and called people on my Christmas card list, and then went and spent a week with friends in Carmel, and then ended up in San Francisco and contacted a few people on my Christmas card list. Christmas cards have been wonderful for me in having people I can reach out to in so many cities. But, and I found a travel agency that is capable. I don't take risk at all. I'm very careful. I'm careful about where I stay. I've learned the hard way to get hotels to arrange for a car to pick me up at the airport and take me back to the airport in a foreign city. I've swallowed my pride, and you can contact any hotel concierge because you can find an email to the hotel and you just put "attention concierge" in the subject line. This hurt badly the first time I did it. I am an older woman traveling alone. Please book me in restaurants that are appropriate for me, that are a short, safe walk from the hotel. And I mean, I had to swallow a lot of pride to say that, but it worked. I mean, they booked me in nearby good restaurants where I'm not going to find myself in a completely alien atmosphere. So, so I've gradually gotten more and more courageous. I said I was scared to death the first time I came here. So.
And you found a community at Colonial Williamsburg as well.
Yes, and now that was something that Lev and I had done a little of, but we had never traveled with Colonial Williamsburg. And so I got more involved there and traveled with them a lot. And I mean, that's one of the things that for me, traveling with nonprofits, whether it's the Smithsonian or whether it's you're a college alumni group, or for me, Colonial Williamsburg, a whole lot. I've done it with the Museum in Texas. I mean, there's so many alumni groups at both institutions. I mean, there are people in this room that I saw in January with people from NHA here in Nantucket. We were there to celebrate the NHA exhibit at the winter show. And so, and you really build I built wonderful friendships all over the country by group travel. And so, but I found that better than doing the fancy commercial tours alone.
Yeah. Well, I have had a great opportunity. I've spent a great time talking with you this afternoon about your book and how you've grown and continue to grow as a widow and as a singleton. And I want to thank you for your book. It's been a great help to me through reflections on my own widowhood and the recent death of my stepdaughter. It's been useful for that tool as well. And thank you.
Well, thank you for having me, Janet. I mean, it really is a treat to be here. So thank you all for coming.